Upon arrival, Abraham suggests Sarai play his sister. Otherwise, these Egyptians will kill him. The narrator does not critique Abram's action. Is he a jerk for subjecting Sarai to the scheme? Or do Abram and Sarai take an extreme action to their own personal shame to preserve the promise? Whereas it may be tough for old people to have children, it is impossible for dead people to have children. He must eat. She must eat. Upon entering Egypt, he and his wife are in extreme danger. Those of us who have read Genesis and Exodus know how strangers get treated. Even if adultery is wrong, murder can be arranged. There's a Bible story about that. Abram is not wrong that they might kill him. He is not wrong that they will want his wife. Would Sarai be better off if her husband was dead or if her so-called brother was around to help? Maybe her brother can slow down the marriage negotiations like Laban does later in the book. Can Abram consult God when God is not there? The issue is not the answer to any of these questions. The issue is that the promise of God is in danger. The old but beautiful Sarai, now in Pharaoh's house, may become pregnant with an Egyptian child. This threat to the promise is met with an appearance by God, plagues, and an exodus from Egypt. Patterns are set whereby Israel may hope for promise amid near certain disaster. Whether readers judge Abraham's actions as good or bad really doesn't matter. Either way, Abram is blessed and the promise is safe. Abram's blessing continues through Genesis 13 and 14. Abraham's nephew Lot separates from Abram and so apparently is not the heir for the promised great nation. However, even as Lot bumbles through the narrative with each action worse than the previous, he remains blessed through his connection to Abram. In Genesis 14, we meet Melchizedek, who blesses Abram and is blessed. Then the king of Sodom, who makes a demand of Abram, and we know how things turn out in Sodom in a few chapters. Those who bless Abram will be blessed. Those who curse Abram will be cursed. The relationship between God and Abram is dramatically illustrated in Genesis 15, in Abram's first dialogue with God. Abram points out to God that Eliezer is Abraham's heir. This is not distrust of the promise. The opposite is ultimately stated. Abraham believed. The promise never indicated whether the great nation would continue biologically from Abraham or through this adopted heir, but it does now. The Lord specifies that the heir will come out from the inside of Abraham's body. God doubles down, promising that Abraham's descendants will then number like the stars. The conversation then shifts to the land where all these people will reside. When God says, "I am the Lord who brought you out from Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land as possession," we best think Exodus again, specifically the Decalogue, where God says, "I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt." Time and again, readers see connections to later Israel in the first father of the nation. As Abram's first statement was not bold enough, he says, "How can I know? How can I know I will inherit this land?" God might like Abraham's question, kind of like God appreciates Job's questions in a later book. God's dramatic response is for Abram to construct an elaborate ritual ceremony with animals cut into pieces. Reading the ceremony with the other biblical example in Jeremiah 34, we find that walking between the cut-up animal pieces is a way of making a vow. Specifically, let me end up like these animals, these cut-up animals, if I break my promise. Most significantly, Abram does not walk through the pieces. God does. Unstated but implied through the ceremony is God's claim. Either I do this, give you this land, or I will die in pieces like these animals. Abram's bold request is met not with critique from God, but with an even bolder promise. It'll take a while, 400 years. Yet another reference to Egypt tips us to think about the many readers of this text, from its inception until now, the many who read this text when suffering amid the absence of God. God assumes, even includes, suffering within the covenant relationship. We must gloss over the theologically complex and intriguing narrative that centers on Hagar. We should note familiar tropes. Hagar, the slave of Sarai, will act as surrogate to provide Abram and Sarah with child. The practice is a legitimate way to gain a child and does not contradict God's previous instructions to Abram. God clarified that the promise would be Abram's biological child. However, Sarah's role or lack of has yet to be mentioned. The child, Ishmael, God hears, is half Egyptian. This very thing was avoided in chapter 12 and must be avoided in 16 as well. As my students recently pointed out in class, after reading chapter 16 in Hebrew, the chapter ends as if the promise has come to fruition with Abram at 86 years old. Not until 1715 do we learn for the first time that Sarai, now Sarah, will play a biological role at 90 years old. Does Abram, now Abraham, laugh out of joy or skepticism? We do not know. But we do know that his laugh provides his next son with a name, Isaac, or he will laugh. As the promise takes longer to fulfill, God seems to repeatedly make the promise more difficult to fulfill. In one more conflict, in Genesis 20, Abram passes Sarah off as his sister again. Abimelech takes Sarah, but is awakened in a dream where God tells him, "Now you are dying." This one's particularly problematic, following that promise of 17. The birth is imminent. Is Sarai pregnant or not? If the king sleeps with Sarah, whose child is this? What if the child is Abram's, but the king claims him? Even at the last moment, the promise is threatened. In contrast to 12, this chapter explicitly states that Abimelech did not sleep with Sarah. However, as chapter 12 stated, Abraham is dangerous. Blessing and curse flow from him. Even when a king claims righteousness and listens to God and listens to the prophet, he will die if he accidentally messes with Abraham and Sarah. Okay, that was intended as a very quick summary of themes, particularly that theme of promise that runs through those chapters. And so I've reserved the majority of the time to get myself in trouble by talking about Genesis 22. I'm going to give an interpretation of Genesis 22. I'm going to do my best, but it is a very difficult text, and I'll leave it at that. Following some more laughing, the child Isaac appears. So God tells Abraham to kill him. The text is as difficult as any, and the interpretive tradition is as expansive as any. The strangeness presents an opportunity to consider larger issues related to the meaning of the theology of Genesis and the theology of the Torah. In one final scene of conflict, God tells Abram to offer Isaac as a whole burnt offering on a mountain in Moriah. Waking early the next day, Abraham and Isaac travel 3 days to the mountain, where Abraham binds Isaac, lifts a knife above him, before being stopped by a messenger of the Lord. Many interpret the narrative as a depiction of the ultimate act of obedience by Abram, some by Isaac as well. However, Immanuel Kant and others in his wake approach the matter differently. Quoting Kant, "If God's voice commands one to do something contrary to the moral law, then no matter how majestic the apparition may be, he must consider it an illusion. The sacrifice that Abraham was going to make by butchering and burning his only son at God's command, the poor child, without knowing it, even brought wood for the fire, Abraham should have replied to this supposedly divine voice, that I ought to kill my good son, that I ought to not kill my good son, is quite certain. But that you, this apparition, are God, of that I am not certain, and never can be, not even if this voice rings down to me from visible heaven." Both of these simple solutions, that this is the ultimate act of obedience or the ultimate act of mistaken obedience, both of these solutions betray the beauty and terror of the text. One interpretation is positive, the other is negative, but they're the same thing. The issue is obedience in both. No doubt this is an aspect of meaning that we should garner from the text. No doubt about that. But there's got to be more. Why this thing? Why right now? Do we really need such an elaborate scenario to say, obey God like Abraham? Is it possible that the text is teaching more? What should a reader see, think, or do after reading this text? Following Kant, many argue that the text encourages violence and abuse. Many engage this argument, and you can read that elsewhere. I've got other plans today. I will say one note on abuse. We do have to remember that by nature, religious teaching involves making authoritative claims. Even though I find Kant's remarks far off from the interest of the text, as we'll see in a minute, anyone who speaks in the name of religion must consider the potentialities for using text and authority to incite abuse, control, or violence. Examples are large and small and too numerous to ignore. We have to be careful when we read biblical text to others. On the other hand, when reading from wisdom of God, we should expect, especially in notoriously difficult texts, that answers may not appear easily. To cite C.S. Lewis, if certain people cannot understand books written for grown-ups, they should not talk about them. So we'll try to read this text as grown-ups, knowing we can only begin to scratch the surface of the meaning of this important and fascinating text. The narrative begins with a command from God for Abraham to go. In fact, the formulation, lech lecha, go, occurs only one other time in the Bible, Genesis 12:1. In both cases, Abraham goes without question. The phrase then bookends the Abraham narrative by paralleling Abraham's call with the climactic moment of the story. The repetition calls us to consider the meaning of this text and how the meaning might be found through dialogue with the broader narrative instead of within these few paragraphs alone. A final note on verse 1 that should frame our interpretation. This is a test. It is the only time Abraham is tested, and the first time we find a test in the Torah. The second series of tests in the Bible occur when Israel moves towards Sinai following the Exodus. Again, Abraham is a cipher for the people of Israel. He is, in fact, moving toward the mountain of God at the moment. He's a cipher for the people of Israel, particularly that group, that great nation who leaves Egypt. We'll talk about this more soon. So a question. Why did God tell Abraham to sacrifice the child? In a narrative filled with conflict and improbability, now that the impossible has happened, the 100-year-old and the 90-year-old have a child. As if that were not extreme enough, let's go more extreme by sacrificing the one we have waited so long. This is likely part of the answer. Think along the lines of Job, extreme upon extreme. With all we've seen in the story of Genesis, this wouldn't even be surprising. The death would take us back to square one, a complete restart. But there's more to be said. So we turn more broadly to the Torah. Many read this chapter as a polemic against child sacrifice which did occur in the ancient world. This text being a teaching that child sacrifice should not happen. I don't think this is correct. This has been the dominant, I think probably the dominant interpretation of the text overall. But I don't think it holds up. A different angle considers the significance of the firstborn to the Lord. In Exodus 4:22, we have God laying claim to the firstborn, a claim that Pharaoh has encroached upon by killing Israelite babies. So you remember the story. The babies are being killed, and then in 4:22, God says, stop it. This is my firstborn. This is not your firstborn. Leave my firstborn alone. But the story continues. When we remember those two texts in chapter 1 and chapter 4 of Exodus, We should realize that the 10th plague is not a random act of violence to show the power of the deity over Pharaoh. The 10th plague is a claim rooted in the plot of the Torah. In fact, right after the 10th plague, in Exodus 13, on the onset of the Exodus, Moses sets regulation concerning the firstborn who belonged to God in remembrance of the Passover. Upon entrance into the land, Israel must offer all firstborn animals and redeem all firstborn sons. Exodus 13:15. Following Sinai, the sentiment is repeated, present in that difficult text in Exodus 22:28. You will give me the firstborn of your sons. No other comment. That's all we get there. In the final section of the Torah, specifically Numbers 3 and 8, the Levites are figuratively sacrificed in chapter 8, verse 11, as substitutes for the firstborn to guard the holiness of the temple and thereby protect Israel from the deity who may kill them by attracting that divine wrath away from the Israelites. The one-for-one replacement, a Levite for a firstborn, appears as the Lord exerts the divine right to replace the firstborn with the Levites following the rebellion of Aaron's firstborn. The Levites are a walking reminder of the Lord's claim on the firstborn and of what led to the 10th plague. So what does any of this have to do with Abraham and Isaac? I hope our next question will begin to fill in these gaps. What is accomplished in the narrative of Genesis 22? The text is explicit here. God says through the messenger, "Now I know that you fear God. You did not withhold your son, your only one, from me." The messenger also states, "Blessing will flow from Abraham over all the earth because you listened to my voice." Both phrases, not surprisingly, are central to the Exodus narrative. Egypt's godlike Pharaoh says, "Who is this Lord?" using the name of God. "Who is Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, that I should listen to his voice?" in Exodus 5. Or when we get to Sinai, we have where Israel is instructed, "If you carefully listen to my voice and guard my covenant, you will be my treasure." You hear the repeats. Abraham is told, "Now I know you fear God." It's said about Abraham, "You listen to my voice." In Exodus 5, why should I listen to that guy's voice? Pharaoh says, "I'm God." It's very clear to everyone around me. We have the same thing for the Israelites when they get to the mountain. They're told, "Listen to this voice." So in a close reversal of God's recognition of Abraham's action, "Now I know that you fear God," we have Moses' indictment of Pharaoh. "I know that you do not yet fear the face of the Lord God," in Exodus 9. Now I know versus I know you do not yet fear. We also have the midwives who fear God and thereby do not dare take the lives of those babies that belong to God in chapter 1 of Exodus. Israel is urged to learn and teach the fear of God to their children, as this fear is a manifestation of their own holiness, that is, God's holiness exuding from them in their action. And we see this in Leviticus 19 and 25 over and over. Finally, upon hearing God speak the Decalogue from Sinai, Israel begs that Moses do the speaking from now on. They don't want to hear this God's voice anymore. Moses assures the people that they should not fear because God is testing them to create fear in them so that they may avoid sin. Exodus 20:20. It's really interesting that Moses tells them, "Don't fear because God is creating fear in you." Okay, that does help us give a little more of a bulky definition to fear, by the way. So strikingly, at the end of the Decalogue, Exodus 20:20, we have the same two verbs, testing and fear, that are used in response to Abraham's action in Genesis 22. Additionally, Abraham spots the mountain of the Lord on the third day. This is the same length of time Israel waits for the Lord to appear at the mountain to deliver the Decalogue. 3 days. So what the Decalogue does for Israel, test and create fear, is already expressed in Abraham, the model of what the people of God should be. One who listens to God's voice and responds appropriately in fear. Okay, so what happens? God accepts the legitimacy of Abraham for the task at hand because he fears and listens. Previously, the Lord questioned aloud if Abraham should be looped in on what would happen at Sodom. The Lord says, "Should I hide from Abraham what I am doing?" God's question is grounded in the fact that Abraham will be a great nation, the first, the leader of that nation. He must do righteousness and justice. He must know how to guard the Lord's ways. He must command his children the same, because as he goes, so will go his children and the nation that emerges. So in this chapter, in 18, God lets Abraham in on some of the wisdom of justice. God's question suggests Abraham is being taught. The verbs are reminiscent of law and Torah. But for now, there is no Sinai. There is no Torah. As we move back to 22, the relationship between God is not static, but exploring. With this event, God recognizes that Abraham fears and listens to God. A reader of this text should contemplate whether God knows if they fear and listen to God, not whether they should sacrifice another person. Again, why kill Isaac? Well, the firstborn belongs to God. Isaac will be offered as a whole burnt offering, a gift offering, not a guilt offering. The willingness to offer the gift and the substitution of the ram parallel the ongoing call from God to Israel for the firstborn and the substitution provided through the Levites in the final section of the Torah. Returning the firstborn of food, of animals, or human is a gift returned to the rightful owner, much unlike Pharaoh, but is a gift returned to the rightful owner by Israel. In the world of Genesis, these laws do not exist. In Genesis, the relationship of the Lord and Abraham must develop to the point where God may state that Abraham models the spirit of the covenant people who listen to the voice and who fear God. So Abraham does this even before law. The antagonist in Exodus, who does not do these things, is Pharaoh. He actually takes them. The protagonist who must do these things post-Sinai is, of course, Israel, the family of Abraham. Encroaching upon this claim, upon the firstborn, was Pharaoh's primary offense. Abraham listens and fears in a way that others do not. He even does so without Moses, without laws, without plagues, following a simple lek lekah, go. A simple go, and Abraham submits to the divine will. Abraham exhibits the right response of obedience, terror, respect that we translate in our Bibles with the word fear. This is the same response needed to live within the holiness of God, that abiding goodness / dangerous terror that resides amid Israel. Of course, all this takes place on the very same mountain, near the very same ground where Israel will experience law and where Levites, as substitutes for Israel's firstborn, guard the holiness of the Lord at the temple. 2 Chronicles 3:1. If they fear God and listen to the voice of God through Moses and the priests, they will experience blessing. Not surprisingly, the Torah ends with blessing. Or if you choose otherwise, curse. Leviticus 26, Deuteronomy 27 and 28. If Israel fears like Abraham, they should expect substitution. If they do not fear, like Pharaoh, there could be disaster. Abraham's statement following the binding of Isaac is important as well. With so many questions throughout, we must pay attention when characters speak. In 22:14, Abraham names the place, "The Lord will see." The narrator then adds, "It is said, today at this mountain, the Lord will see." These statements fit well with our understanding of the plot of the Torah. Abraham states that God will look up on this mountain in the future, will consider the binding of Isaac to the benefit of Israel forever. Other biblical references to the mountain of the Lord refer either to Sinai or the temple. Immediately following Abraham's statement, the messenger on behalf of God recommenced the blessing for all Israel. The binding of Isaac with the themes of firstborn, Passover, Exodus, temple, obedience, substitution become a didactic text. This is the first time God intervenes with this model Israelite in a way and at this very place that God will continually see, the key word of the text, God will continually see to allow for substitution and redemption of the firstborn in future generations. I've often heard the question asked in religious settings, how would you react if God told you to sacrifice your child? Would you be willing to do anything for God? This returns us to Kant. The question presupposes a misunderstanding of the story. The story is not a story of ethics, even though Kant reads it this way. It is a story of narrative theology. This is how we just read it. Again, the story is foundational for understanding the relationship between God and the people of God. The story within its literary setting is written in such a way to show all Jewish and Christian readers that God will not ask such a thing. We'll conclude here with a kind of short, far too short, reading of how the Abraham narratives now contribute to the canon of Scripture. So let's conclude by suggesting a theological reading from Genesis, guided by the themes of family, creation, and holiness, that may aid our preaching of these texts. In Genesis, Abraham, as well as Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, are recipients of the Lord's promise. Note the intentional shift at the death of Abraham. Immediately after Abraham dies, the text says, after the death of Abraham, God blessed Isaac, his son. To be sure that we don't miss the main theme of the text. Do God's promises absolve humans from acting or require humans to act? Either way, humans must move and act simply to live. Conflict ensues, suffering emerges. For Abraham, blessing comes not easily, so that there is no doubt it is of God. On more than one occasion, God's speech explicitly identifies Abraham as a model or teacher for the great nation and the blessing that will emerge. As Genesis 1 through 11 illustrates, God's promises are delivered into a world of humans. A world full of violent humans endangers the status of holiness within the creative order. Even though he is chosen for unknown reasons, Abraham consistently appears as one who will teach children, families, and nations of justice, who will fear God, and who will listen to the voice of God. The Torah is the story of a family emerging from and existing within God's creation. A family brought into existence with a call focused beyond itself. A family for all families of the earth. Abraham meets a God and teaches readers of a God who adopts a relational perspective toward humanity. A God beyond and within creation. Abraham's family exists to maintain this, God's desired relationship with this creation. Before Exodus and law, Abraham exhibits qualities and actions signaling what his family can be relationally with God for creation. This is of utmost importance, as later in this very story, God will descend upon a desert mountain, teach, and albeit reluctantly, abide amid Israel. Creation is incomplete until Exodus 40, when God enters creation among Abraham's family in the tabernacle. The Torah comes to completion as priests and Levites, the generations of Aaron and Moses, care for creation by teaching the law and guarding that double-sided holiness exuding from God's presence. That holiness that lives with Israel, impacting creation for good, but also exudes destructive tendencies when not complemented by fear and adherence to the voice of God. Like so many biblical texts, the Abraham narratives address suffering, experienced by every single human, even if not in the same frequency, even if not in the same manner. Suffering is a lens for experiencing life as well as Scripture. An answer to suffering in the Torah is promise. Promise delivered through a family. Promise maintained through a priesthood. One of the many facets of promise within a canonical perspective, is that the promise remains future. All of God's promises to Abraham are fulfilled, but not fulfilled. He receives land, a well, and a cave, but not the land. The great nation begins with Isaac, but this is not the great nation. God blesses nations through Ishmael and through Joseph's feeding of the nations of the earth, but readers really expect more when we're talking about blessing the nations. Just like Abraham's life is met with conflict after conflict, with threats to the promise at every turn, so it goes for the readers of this narrative. Almost as soon as Israel becomes a great nation, in the days of David and Solomon, Israel divides into less than a great nation. Having waited 400 plus years for that promise from Genesis 15, within 100 more, the promise seems dying. Within a few hundred more, the Assyrians and later the Babylonians approach. God's house is burned and the promise seems dead. Yet this is never the approach Israel's literature provides. Instead, Ezekiel, Micah, Isaiah, Nehemiah, Luke, Paul, only to name a few, consistently appeal to the promise of Abraham in the lowest moments of the people of God. Why? This initial promise to the initial father will happen. If it does not, no other promise matters. As bad as situations get in Israel, Israel remains convinced because the story of Abraham is the answer to the problem of suffering. Long after the kingdom of Israel splits, still suffering, God's people continue expectation. They ask, when will Israel be restored? It must. Reading of Abraham in a Christian context should help us articulate how God's promise of blessing did not end, nor was the expectation thwarted or tossed onto a new people. Rather, as Luke Acts narrates, Israel is restored by an anointed one from the family of Abraham, a Passover lamb, a firstborn, a king, a priest, who killed the enemy, the one known as death. By reconstituting order in creation and abiding among humans with holiness, just like that tabernacle. This king initiates restoration with the purpose that Genesis 12 promises. Through Abraham and Israel, God will bless the nations. It's too much, too fast. But the point, God's people, Israel, meet suffering with promise and hope. Though probably not fair to label Abraham's narrative with that inaugurated eschatology that we call the already not yet, the promise given by God and the blessings flowing from Abraham initiate this outlook in centuries of readers. Following the defeat of death, we proclaim, like Abraham and Israel, even as we experience the promise, we wait for the promise. Okay. That is a reading of the generations of Terah. As I'm sure you noticed, there are many more that could be read. A lot of this depends on where you start, what you identify as the structure, what you identify as the beginning and the ending of the book. But I do think these themes are there, just like so many others are. And so it's I guess the final word is we're grateful that it's such a complex text. We can read it and learn, and we can read it again and learn something else.